All right, so we are live. Thank you so much, everyone, for your patience. We had some technical issues on the back end, but we seem to fix that, so we're all good. So thank you so much. So good afternoon and welcome again, everyone. This session today is titled Made with You in Mind and Redesigning the Employee Experience. My name is Miriam Chamberlain. I'm one of the event hosts today. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Sabrina Meherally. Almost got that right.
Meherally, yeah.
Meherally, there we go. Sabrina is an inclusive design thought leader with over a decade of experience in human resources, user experience design, and product management. Sabrina founded Pause and Effect. Pause and Effect is an inclusive design consultancy built on the premise that thoughtful, inclusive, and planet-centered solutions are the byproduct of slowing down. Sabrina and her team partner with organizations to build customer products and employee experiences that are usable by, respectful to, and delightful for people from all walks of life. Sabrina believes that change starts with our ability to contemplate and to imagine alternative, liberated futures. She is energized by speculative fiction, sci-fi, travel adventures, and a great cup of coffee. So it's really great to have you spend your time with us today, Sabrina. Before I turn it over to you, there's just some things I'd like to highlight. I'm sure most are familiar by now, but we do have a conversations tab for comments, suggestions, thoughts throughout the presentations. Let's keep this engaging. And then there'll be a Q&A period at the final 10 minutes of the presentation as well. If you'd like to come on stage, please raise your hand. If anyone would like to tweet or post, there's hashtag SHRC21. I'll drop that into the chat as well so everyone has that. And just a final note to remind everyone that this session is being recorded. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to you, Sabrina, to get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Miriam, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. I am here talking to you today about how to build an employee experience that is made with you in mind. So what I'll do first is I'll try to share my screen here. And hopefully that works. So I always like to start off with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that I am presently joining you today from the unceded stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. In providing land acknowledgements, I think my journey has changed over time, and in what started as grounding myself in truth, which still holds true, understanding the land that I'm on and what its significance means. And my journey as being the daughter of refugee and immigrant parents, the complexities that come with also being a settler here on stolen land. And since those earlier realizations, my journey in acknowledging the land has evolved over time, where I now am really contemplating not only what I benefit or how I benefit from the land, but what my role is in reciprocity and returning to the land. And so it's been an evolution in my own thinking and really trying to figure out and be more attentive throughout my days to what ways do I show up for the land? How do I demonstrate respect and responsibility to the land, recognizing all that I benefit from? So for those of you who aren't familiar with land acknowledgements or would like to learn more, I've provided a couple of links here on this slide. So a little bit more about me. My background was actually in human resources for about 10 years. And all the while, in the HR space, I was really passionate about innovation in HR. And I remember learning about design thinking about 10 years before it became really popular and more mainstream and acceptable in the HR space. And I remember trying to figure out ways to incorporate design thinking into the HR world to make employee experiences ones where folks could feel seen and reflected. I took those skills and that strength in design thinking into the customer world, and I started building employee experiences, customer experiences, customer products, customer services. And in that space, what I noticed is that whenever we were innovating and building customer experiences, what we tended to forget about were the people who experienced the most barriers or were the most disadvantaged in our society. And the interesting thing about that is that when we are focusing on, and we'll talk more about this, when we're focusing on people who carry more privilege in when we design products or we design services, we are unintentionally or perhaps unconsciously recreating the exact system that we in diversity and inclusion are trying to level or change or shift. And so I founded Pause and Effect 3 years ago, and Pause and Effect is an organization that helps partner with companies to make products, services, and experiences more equitable, inclusive, and environmentally relational, as we're calling it. As I mentioned, when I did the land acknowledgement, really trying to figure out what reciprocity looks like in the environmental context, and figuring out how customer experiences and employee experiences can be designed in such a way. But today we're going to focus more on the inclusive and equitable side. So one truth that we have to come to terms with when it comes to the employee experience right off the bat is that the employee experience is a product of design. We think about what we do in the HR world. We are recruiting, we are providing learning opportunities, we are building development plans, we are designing benefits packages. All of these things that we encounter on a day-to-day basis in the HR world have been designed. And so if we know that whatever products or programs or policies that exist in HR have been designed, we can also recognize that what has been designed, serving its purpose and resulting in what we see as the employee experience now, but it has the possibility of being redesigned to be better, to create more opportunity for more folks. So when we talk about design, design is the process of envisioning, planning, the creation of objects, services, policies, processes, spaces. It's essentially, simply put, having an idea and making it real. And design is the process of thinking about something and making it real. So if we use this term of design, instead of using a term such as graphic design, or instead of referring to design as something like graphic design or visual design or architectural design, we can see that in our roles day to day, we are all designers. Every single one of us has the power to and does design. So when we talk about the term inclusive design is the process of designing those things, those products, services, policies, processes, environments, in a manner that considers the full range of human diversity. And the purpose is to create positive, usable, and accessible experiences for as many people as possible. So before we go any further, there's a critical difference to call out between intent and impact. Many times, many of us in the HR space, in the product space, don't intend to cause harm or exclusion. We assume, and we also go in with the intention of creating something that can be usable and enjoyed by everyone. But what we forget to do at times is cross-reference what our intent was to what our impact actually is. And so I wanted to put this up here for everybody to see. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts regarding this image here. What might have been the intent and what might have been the impact? And I'm looking into the chat to see if anybody has any comments around that. Yeah, great. The intent is accessibility and the impact is the lack of accessibility. Yes, no automatic door, correct. So we can see here that while the intent was, okay, well, let's just make sure that we create a room that has every, we're opening to multiple genders. We're saying this is an accessible washroom for folks that have disability. It's also a shower apparently. And but then we have this step here, and then we have no button on the side. So you can see that This is when design isn't really thoughtful. It's when we intend to do something, but the impact isn't actually inclusive or accessible. This is an easy one, but sometimes it can be a bit more subtle. Sometimes it can look just like this. While everybody gets a day off, everyone has the ability to take this time off. And this is where I note a really critical difference between just access and belonging. We have things that that surround us. I like to give the example of a Band-Aid. If you had asked me 10 years ago, 5 years ago, did I feel like the Band-Aid gave me a sense of inclusion? I would say, yeah, it works for me. It works. But as I start to see that new Band-Aids are coming out that have different skin tones, and I wear a Band-Aid that's brown, and I look at that and I realize, like, wow, I've never looked at my skin and seen a Band-Aid almost match my skin complexion. That is creating a sense of belonging. It's not just about access. Can everybody use the Band-Aid, or can most people use the Band-Aid? Yes. But does everyone have the same level of feeling of belonging? So I look at that also within our HR practices and our HR policies, looking at something like this, our statutory holiday list, and thinking, who might not be able to benefit in the same way? So why does this happen? It happens because we tend to design for what we call the normal or average person. And this is kind of how we look at people. We look at people along a bell curve, and we make this assumption that most people are here in the middle. And then some people are on the outside, and other people are on the outside here. But if we design something for what we call the average or normal person, then it should work for most people. And then we can make little adjustments if we need to adapt to these people. But one of the myths of this is that it makes a lot of assumptions. It makes assumptions that we don't carry multiple aspects to our identity. When we look at something like the bell curve, we're assuming a singular identity. The truth is that we're made and comprised of multiple aspects to our identity, some of which carry privilege, some of which don't carry privilege. And so when we look at the complexity of human beings, we can see that it's really, it's far too simplified to assume that we can have an average person, and then we have the people on the outside. The other myth that this assumes is that we don't move from being privileged to not having privilege. And for example, we could look at folks that obtain disabilities later on in life. Sometimes people move within the spectrum as well of privilege to oppressed or marginalized. And so that complexity, and also providing our circumstances and where we are. So recognizing that it's too simplified to assume that there is such thing as an average person. An example here is there was way back, they tried to make pilot seats designed for what they called the average person. So they conducted all these body measurements to see if folks would be able to craft a seat that would work for people who had all different body shapes by taking what was the average body size. And it ended up not working for everyone because the average isn't reflective of the margins. So if we actually look at designing for people who have the more extreme, we end up including a lot of people that also are not in the extreme. These are the people that we tend to exclude. We tend to leave out, and these are only some of the people that we tend to exclude. Senior folks, people who live in remote or rural areas, women, immigrants, folks with disabilities, racialized people, the Indigenous community, people with low literacy, folks with low income, and the Two-Spirit LGBTQIA community as well. So one thing that we have to be mindful of here is that different people experience design differently. So in the HR world, for example, we can look at something like the Employee Assistance Program. And if we think about different identities, what is the experience of people with different identities as they engage with or interact with the Employee Assistance Program? Is it right to make the assumption that everybody has the same experience? Who benefits the most from the Employee Assistance Program? Who might be the most excluded or the most disadvantaged? Who could use the services the most? And are those people being prioritized in the design or creation of this program? So we can see this through a quick statistics piece here, that when we look at folks who are psychologists and we look at the breakdown by race, this is a US statistic, but still is quite insightful, that while white folks make up 65.1% of the population, they are 83.5% of psychologists in the US. Whereas for Black folks, making up 11.9% of the population, they are only 4.9% of the population of psychologists. And so you can look at that and think about how important it is to have lived experience represented in the people that you're talking to or seeking therapy from. How important is it for somebody who you're obtaining therapy from to understand your own lived experience and your own identity? So if we know that to be true, what might be the barriers or what might be the difference of experience for our racialized employees when they're seeking out therapy? Who benefits the most? Who doesn't benefit? Or who experiences more harm? So these are the questions that we encourage folks to think about. The goal here is to minimize harm, minimize exclusion, and minimize extraction. And I'll talk a bit about extraction in a moment. And in doing so, we would increase safety, increase inclusion and equity, and increase reciprocity. So one of the things we do when we talk about this inquiry into who benefits, who might be excluded, who might be harmed, is we think about the gaps in our information. We think about what we don't know. We might not know who is experiencing the most benefit through our learning programs. We might not know who's experiencing the most disadvantage or harm through our learning programs. And so we tend to say, okay, well, let's go talk to the employees. Let's go learn from our employees who are ERGs and ask folks to share with us what their lived experiences are. And it's all great for the organization to tap into this mode of learning and listening. But it's really important for us to not fall under the category of extraction. When we talk about extraction, we mean pulling information from a group for the purposes of saying, oh, well, if you tell us all this stuff, we'll create an environment that works for you, so then you benefit too. But the truth is the organization benefits. The organization benefits. And so what does reciprocity look like in this exchange of asking folks to share what their traumas are, to share their lived experience, to be vulnerable, and to help us as an organization grow? So when we talk about the method and the mode of really uncovering this data, which is really important for us, we ask organizations, we ask HR folks to think about how we can create reciprocal relationships of exchange. So inclusive design is not an improvement. It is an imperative. We see this usually as the afterthought. Let me design something for the folks who have privilege, and then I'll design it for people who are more disadvantaged, who are more marginalized, who are oppressed. And we recreate the system and we reinforce the system as is, because we're favoring identities that are privileged and then treating identities that are more oppressed as the afterthought. So if we switch it from an improvement to an imperative, we see a lot more opportunity unfold to change the system. So some of you might be wondering, okay, well, where do I begin? How do I start to think about my programs, my practices, my policies in HR from an equity and inclusion lens. The first thing is to pause. When we are rushing to the finish line, when we are trying to get things done within a tight time frame, when we operate from a place of urgency, we end up operating from a place of familiarity. We end up doing things that are familiar because it's just something that we've always done, and we don't give ourselves that window, that moment to stop and think, how is this landing for people? You know, what cross-referencing, checking what our intent was to what our impact actually is. And so that pause is really important as a starting point for us. We look at inclusive design as these three pieces here. The first is purpose. What did I intend to do? What is the purpose of this? And who might benefit the most from this purpose? And then looking at people. Which people have been involved in the design of what I've put forward? If we only have people that represent a certain identity that are building or creating or designing something, their identities are likely going to be reflected in the product or in the service or in the policy or in the practice. So how have we included folks that have marginalized and underrepresented identities in not just giving us information, but in the decision making, in the actual design of the solution? And then the process piece here is where we touch on equity when I was referring to non-extractive processes of reciprocity. So thinking about in the process piece, how do we start to create processes that are equitable, processes of inquiry where we are respectfully learning and co-creating with people? So lastly, I just wanted to share this, which is an identity wheel that we tend to use. We shuffle things around at times, but this identity wheel talks about multiple aspects of our identity in the form of what is privileged is closer to the center and what is the most oppressed is on the outside. So as we look through this identity wheel, we might want to ask ourselves, what is the intent of the product or the policy or the practice that we have in HR? Who could benefit the most? Who could benefit the most? Which identities might benefit the most? Who does benefit the most? Who might be the most disadvantaged? And who might be harmed? So I wanted to leave everybody off with this one piece here, which is this critical difference between focusing on, can everyone use it? Is it accessible to everyone? Which is excellent. We have to focus on this. Then also recognizing, does everyone feel safe and welcome? How does this promote dignity and respect for all? How does this celebrate diversity? And then lastly, this piece around justice. How can we redistribute power? How does this account for systemic oppression? And how does this promote justice or accountability? So going back to that Band-Aid example, talked about access, then we talked about belonging. Justice would look like, or injustice might look like the Band-Aid that is representative of different skin complexions being priced at a higher price. Thinking about what message we might be sending to the public if the Band-Aids that were for racialized skin tones were priced higher. So when we think about justice, how can we redistribute power? How can we change the system through what we're producing? So I wanted to open this up now for just some discussion and ask if folks had any questions or any thoughts. There's a lot of content here, and there's a complex process for achieving a more inclusive or equitable outcome in HR. So I'm curious if anybody had any questions.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That was incredibly insightful. And yes, lots of content there, but I do have one question, but I'll wait to see if there's any questions coming through. Does anyone want to come on stage and interact with Sabrina on a question? No, we don't seem to have any just yet. Sabrina, I did have a question, and I know you touched on this, but maybe we can reiterate the difference between the human-centered design versus inclusive design.
Yeah, so in human-centered design, we tend to go through the process of, for example, it starts with empathy and learning from community and listening. But what we often tend to forget about or not think about is who experiences the greatest disadvantage, and how can I represent those folks in the processes along human-centered design. Mm-hmm. So what ends up happening is that we favor privileged identities in human-centered design. The processes and the methodologies even used within human-centered design, sometimes we hear and talk about design sprints, for example, like these really condensed days where we go through an innovation process. The process and the practice of design sprints in and of itself is quite exclusive. There are certain people that would not be able to participate in a sprint because it isn't designed in a way that is conducive for those people to participate. Thinking about processors, thinking about people that might be neurodivergent or have different types of needs. Mm-hmm. So if we just stick to a sort of framework and we invite people to participate that can participate, we're limiting our ability to actually glean insights from the people that might add a tremendous amount of value and might benefit from what we're putting forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And we did have a comment here from Tanya. So the identity wheel is incredible and really helpful. I thought so too. Who is the creator of the wheel? I would like to share it with my team, but would like to provide credit where it's due.
Oh, great. We created the wheel at Pause and Effect. So the wheel has been designed by us. It is an adaptation. We've adapted it. So if you even go on Google and look at the wheel of power and privilege, there are numerous wheels that are out there to give folks an idea. We've just extended or made it broader.
Very good. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. And so, Sabrina, with that in mind, is that where we start? Like, where do we start? Maybe I know it's a big question.
Yeah. But what I wanted to include in this presentation, and just because of the length of time here, it made it challenging, but there is, if we take something like the candidate journey and we look at the employee experience, what does that experience look like? What are the stages of that journey? So we might look at something like, okay, you apply for, you find the job, then you choose to apply for the job. Then you submit your application, whatever that looks like. So if we're requiring a resume, then you have to create a resume and you have to submit a resume. Then you wait to hear a call back. And so if we kind of did every step of that particular journey and we said, what were the thoughts and feelings or experiences of somebody going through that journey that has an identity like ours? So if we're thinking about ourselves, what's our experience as we go through that journey as an applicant? All of us have applied, most of us have applied to roles before. So thinking about what our particular thoughts, feelings, experiences were along that journey. And then think about, is that experience reflective of people who might carry the most marginalized or most oppressed identities? So for example, if we think about somebody that is a newcomer to Canada, and we think about maybe they have English as a second language. Maybe there's some cultural differences. Maybe there's, other particular barriers or a lack of trust or unfamiliarity with the Canadian business landscape. How are they going to engage with that career candidate journey or the employee experience of applying for a job? What might be some of the barriers that they would encounter that I might not encounter or you might not encounter? And so if we don't lean in to the experiences of people that carry the most barriers, but would a newcomer benefit from new employment? Absolutely. Probably more so if they're new to the country and really reliant on it than somebody that is performing really well in a job and just wants a career change. So if we start thinking about the people that are on the margins and their particular experiences going through those journeys, we can then allow ourselves that space to open up our minds to see what other opportunities might exist for changes within our practices and our processes.
Yeah, that's definitely well said, Sabrina. We do have one question that came in from Salima. So Salima asks, what can people leaders do differently to influence this mindset?
Yeah, great question, Salima. I think one is, and it sounds simple, but it really isn't, is creating space, creating opportunities for that pause. When we are operating, as I said, from urgency and we are rushing to get things done, we don't ask these critical, thoughtful questions. You can take anything from HR, like even if we just want to take the interview process itself, just look at the interview process, giving ourselves that space to think about that process and who might benefit from it, who might be the most advantaged in that process, who might be the most disadvantaged, who might be the most harmed. It gives us that opportunity to actively critique those practices that we have just become so accustomed to and so used to on a day-to-day basis. We don't see what we don't see because we're operating from that place of familiarity. So when we stop and we allow ourselves that space to, and the freedom and the culture climate in the organization to critique these things from a perspective of inclusion and diversity, we can see so much more opportunity.
Well, I know my big takeaway from this, Sabrina, is going to be take a breath, pause, definitely. Because I think our days are full, right? Especially in a virtual working environment as well, with back-to-back meetings and, to get our finger on the pulse and to really feel what's happening and to engage that way. I think we definitely need to take a step back sometime and really pause. So thank you for that. Are there any other questions or anyone else that'd like to come on? Anyone would like to come on stage? No. Any final words, Sabrina, before we wrap up?
Yeah, one thing that I'll just add is that sometimes we feel like, and this is another myth, is that when we're designing for folks that, or when we're designing with diversity in mind, and we're designing with folks that carry the most oppressed, marginalized identities in mind, we sometimes make the assumption that we're designing just for those people. We sometimes assume that, okay, well, if I'm going to think about people that carry all the oppressed identities, then I'm not designing for anybody who has privilege. And that's one of the big myths here. Because if you look at something like audiobooks, for example, audiobooks didn't start as a solution that was intended for everybody to use and with privileged identities at the center. They started with the realization that certain people who could not read needed the ability to absorb information auditorily. So it was that innovation and that example that then extended to benefit so many different folks, people who learn differently, people who were in the middle of commuting and wanted to listen to a book. And so one of the things that we have to realize is that when we are designing with the margins in mind, we are actually oftentimes designing solutions for a lot more than those people, because a lot of people have those particular needs. So not to get lost in the idea that that's how this becomes the afterthought. So recognizing that it doesn't have to be the afterthought and it can still benefit everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to have these communities such as the HR community to lean on each other and share those insights and design thinking behind it. So thank you very much, Sabrina. Great presentation. And I encourage everyone to, we're going to sign off in just about a minute. I encourage everyone to do the speed networking if you haven't already, to meet some really great people. Also, there is the booths that you can go and circulate to visit some of our sponsors. And our next session will be starting at 2:25 actually. So I'll see you all there. Thank you so much. Have a great day.